Everyone, I'm Lynette Villaver, and yes, we're done with Asian literature, and this time I will be discussing the African literature, a tradition of myth and stereotypes. So these are the topic outline that we will be discussing. First is the background, historical influence, introduction, the five major themes of African literature, types of African literature, a collection of short stories, African folk tales, fables, and fairy tales, and also the African writers and their works. So here is the brief background about Africa. The origin of the name Africa is greatly disputed by scholars. Most believe it stems from words used by the Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans. Important words include the Egyptian word Afro-Ika, meaning motherland, the Greek word Afrik, meaning without cold, and the Latin word Africa, meaning sunny. So, Africa, the second largest continent after Asia, covering about one-fifth of the total land surface of Earth. And the knowledge of most of the individual languages of Africa is still very incomplete, but there are known to be in excess of 1,500 distinct languages. And Islam is the dominant religion in Africa. Christianity is the second. Arabic is also the most widely spoken language in Africa. So let's talk about the historical influence of African literature. So it said that in the period between 1881 and 1914, known as the Scramble for Africa, numerous European powers took control of most of Africa. The only three countries untouched by the Europeans were the Dervish state, Liberia, and Ethiopia. The Atlantic slave trade involved the movement of more than 12 million African people to America to work as slaves. Some of these slaves eventually gained their freedom, and those who were literate started writing stories to fight against slavery by recounting their horrifying experiences as slaves. When we say scramble for Africa, is the term that historians use to refer to the expansion of European empires into Africa during the age of imperialism. It is referred to as scramble due to the way in which the European nations raced to capture territory to expand to their empires. And these are the European powers, no? Ito yung mga bansa na sumakop dito sa Africa. The Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. And sabi nga dito, no, um, there are African people, no, na nagwork as slaves, but um, most of them, those who were literate, started writing their stories to fight against slavery. So, hindi lahat ay nag-work. And those African people, no, yung nag-start na magsulat, ito na sila na-inspired to write novels, stories, ganyan. And it is about the experiences, mga experiences nila as slave. So, dito na pala nag-start talaga yung um, mga stories niya, mga inspired by their experiences. So, for the introduction, African literature not only comes in the written form but also as oral literature. Before colonialism, Africans would tell their stories orally and through performance, sometimes using music as well. African literature reflects the stories of people from hundreds of years ago and the people who live now. It is hugely important part of the literary world as it brings underrepresented voices to the fore and allows them to retell their experiences of the world. The relationship between oral and written traditions, and in particular between oral and modern written literature, is one of great complexity and not a matter of simple evolution. Modern African literatures were born in the educational systems imposed by colonialism with models drawn for Europe rather than existing African traditions. But the African oral tradition exerted their own influence on these literatures. So there are five major themes of African literature. First is the colonialism, tradition, displacement, liberation, and nationalism. So there are also types of African literature. These are oral African literature, pre-colonial African literature, the colonial African literature, and the post-colonial literature. So what about the oral African literature? So oral African literature, it is performative. It is mythological and historical. It is portray a certain image by dressing up a specific character. So the performance, tone, riddles, and proverbs were the key components of oral African literature. So these are the key components, no? The storytelling, riddles, lyric, proverbs. So storytelling, sensory union of image and idea, a process of recreating the past in terms of the present, uses realistic images to describe the present and fantasy images to evoke and embody the substance of a culture's experience of the past. So, the oral African literature, so now when we say performative, no, it is more on actual than written. So, mythological. So, when we say mythological, um, it related to myths, no? Referring to fanciful creatures and heroes. And historical, so comes from the past events. So, the storytelling, no? Not the usual storytelling of Philippine literature, no? The African literature, um, they used the images, they used the realistic images, no? So, so when we say realistic images, the performer also had visual aids. So they have the visual aids during their performance. They did it face to face in public, and they were able to perform in specific ways by using mimicry, gestures, and expression to produce an impact on their audience. So, meaning the oral literature was versatile and communal. Why? Because they can introduce pieces of their older stories, and also they can create completely new content and structures in their stories. So, next is the riddles. Figurative form, the riddle is composed of two sets. So, the riddle in African literature composed of two sets. So, for example, a pot without an opening, they called an egg. The silly man who dragged his intestine, a needle and thread. So, medyo in the form of figurative, no? Yung riddles. And also, uh, more on imagery. So it is intellectual than a poetic activities, and between the reality and fantasy. So in lyric, interact in dynamic passion, establishing metaphorical relationship within the poem. And so it is the riddling is the motor of the lyric. So when we say lyric in African literature, it is metaphorical, no? Everything in the lyric is directed to the revelation of metaphor. So yes, it invokes paradox and proverb. So it says that metaphorical aspects, so may word na naman ng metaphorical, establishes ties with its metaphorical equivalent in the real life of the members of the audience, or with the wisdom of the past. So, ang proverb naman in African literature is similar to that riddle and a lyric poem. Why? Because they also have an metaphorical aspects, and the proverbs is it provide insight, and your words of proverbs are a riddle that waiting to happen. So they have their similarities din naman, no? So next is the now let's move on to the next oral African literature. No, the key components, what we call the tale, heroic poetry, and epic. So the tale, so I said that the riddle, lyric, and proverb are the materials that are at the dynamic center of the tale. The patterning of imagery is the main instrument that shapes a tale. So same din, no, dun sa the lyric, no, and um, the poem or the storytelling of African literature consists of imagery. So, for example, the quivet, what do you want? I'm leaving my food behind on the prairie. I'm leaving it behind. I'm leaving it behind. So, this quote from the tale of the Sosa. The story of an ogre chases a woman and her two children. So, this tale of African literature drawn into two repertories, the contemporary and the ancient tradition. So, when say contemporary, it is on realistic images, and from the Asian tradition, so more on fantasy images. So, heroic poetry, the metaphorical connections are frequently made between historical personages or events and images of animals. So, for example, the fantasy aspects of this kind of poetry are to be found in its construction, in the merging of the real and the animal in metaphorical ways. So, they use animals, no, as heroes in this heroic poetry. At same, they're also metaphorical connections, no, and historical. So, next is the epic. An epic may be built around a genealogical system with parts of it developed and embellished into a story. The epic, like the heroic poem, contains historical references such as place, names, and events. In the heroic poem, these are greatly developed. So, for example, is the Ivonia, an epic poem of Madagascar. So, as you can see, as you notice, no, there are also similarities about the other key components of African literature. So, like others key components, there are also contain historical references. No? Lagi nababanggit yung historical, and also and the epic also be built around a genealogical system. So when we say genealogical system, no, history of a family. So may mga history ng family or several generation. So centers on the character of the hero. And also um, the epic performer remembered the great events and turning points of cultural history. So, hindi mawawala talaga sa African literature yung history and traditions, no? So, now let's move on to the pre-colonial African literature. So, it said that pre-colonial African literature is the literature written between the 15th and 19th centuries and includes the Atlantic slave trade. These stories were based on the folklore or different regions in African countries. So, for example, the Anansi the spider, a tale from the Ashanti. Sungura is a hare in folklore in East Africa and Central Africa. So, in this pre-colonial African literature, no, take note that uh, there already existed, no, the in African literature. May mga literature na din talaga ang Africa bago pa sila sakupin nitong Europeans or the Atlantic, no, slave trade. And yun nga, during that time, they also wrote the folklore in their native language. And these are the folklore stories are examples of their African literature. So let's now proceed to the colonial African literature. Colonial African literature was produced between the end of World War I and African independence, or the date of which depends on the different countries, such as Ghana's 1957 independence from British control and Algeria's independence in 1962 from France. Contain themes of independence, liberation, and negritude. So, African people use elements of beauty to portray crucial facts and information about African society. So, if you notice, these are uh, the poetry na sinulat nung time na during that period. So, when we say negritude naman, so negritude is a movement starting in the 1930s led by African people in places controlled by the French who were raising awareness of black consciousness and protesting against French colonization. So, no, ito yung mga poem na sinulat during that period ay inspired with the theme, no, of the uh, independence, liberation, and negritude. So, sinearch ko siya, yung mga title na yan, and it turned out na, ayun, nakasulat siya kasi sa French language. So, mahirap, intindihin, mahirap, yung mga, yung poem na yan. So, yan. So, the post-colonial African literature naman, the main themes that African authors explore in post-colonial African literature are the relationship between modernity and tradition, the relationship between Africa's past and Africa's present, individuality and collectivism, the notion of foreignness and indigenous, capitalism and socialism, and what it means to be African. So, writers no, in this period wrote in both Western languages and African languages. So, the main themes that African authors explore in colonial African literature are the relationship between modernity. So, andyan na yung medyo na sila sa modernization. So, writers no who will reflect these themes in their writing include The Arrow of God in 1964 of Chinua Achebe. So, and also The Wizard of the Crow 2006 by Ngugiwa Chongho. So, I have here the quote from the Purple Hibiscus, no. When she made a U-turn and went back the way we had come, I let my mind drift, imagining God laying out the hills of Nuska with his white hands, crescent moon shadows underneath his nails, just like uh, Father Benedict's. So in the quote below from Purple Hibiscus, no, by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. So the author reflects on the relationship between Africa's past and present by showing how Kambili has been taught to see God as white. For her, God can't be her skin color, as the color black isn't pure enough for God. It also presents that the strained relationship she has with her skin color and her understanding that the color white is good and pure. So, the collection of short stories in African literature. So, first is The Wives at War and Other Stories in 1980 by Flora Wafa. So, stories that portray the different experiences of women during the Nigerian Civil War and show the bravery of the military leaders of Biafra's women organization. So, this collection of short stories focuses on the involvement of women in wars during that time. So, they portray the different experiences of women during the um, civ- Nigerian Civil War. So, the stories also portrays women hatred of war, and there are women who are not interested in politics and rather focus more on familiar concerns. These are some who would sacrifice everything to prevent their loved ones from being conscripted into the army. So, yun yung pinaka-highlight itong story of Wives at War and Other Stories. So, next, this Let's Tell the Story Properly in 2014 by Jennifer Nansugba Makumbi. So, Makumbi represents the lives of Ugandas in Britain. Whether they are highly visible individuals or barely noticed, whether they care for the elderly or work in hospitals. Makumbi aims to show how the lives of Ugandans who live in Britain are not included in white British life. So, in this collection of short stories of Makumbi, present the lives of Ugandans in Britain. So, Britain are not included in white British life. As these characters try to find themselves in Britain, the homeland drifts further and further away from them. So, next is The Who Will Greet You at Home, 2015 by Leslie Nyeka Arima. So, she uses this story to critique Nigerian society's obsession with babies. She criticized the belief that a woman can only achieve her purpose by having children. So, in these stories naman, it was set in a surrealistic version of Lagos. Women must fabricate a child out of materials from the earth. The special ingredient is words from an elderly woman, and they must take care of it for a year before it comes to light. So, so the author used this story to critique Nigerian society's obsession. So, ito naman yung gustong i-highlight ni Leslie dito sa stories niya. Other stories from African literature. What It Means When a Man Falls from the Sky, 2017 by Leslie Nyeka Arima. So, ayan, siya rin yung author kanina. A Private Experience, 2008 by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Tales of Tenderness and Power, 1991 by Bessie Head. I Am Not My Skin, 2017 by Nima Komba. Diplomatic Pounds and Other Stories, 2012 by Ama Ata Aido, and Gotel the Sun, 2011 by Wayne Mollif. African folktales, fables, and fairy tales. So, this time, ito naman yung mga folktales, fables, and fairy tales of Africa. So, ano ba sinasabi dito sa when we say folk tales, fables, and fairy tales? The body of African folklore encompasses tales from multiple regions of Africa, including fairy tales and folk tales from South Africa, Nigeria, Rhodesia, and Zanzibar. The tales from Africa aren't just stories, they are living pieces of history and culture to those who tell them. Many of the stories bear characteristics that belong to the region from which they came, and the authors often collected their stories by region. So, animals are prominent in African folk tales, especially the monkey, elephant, lion, and giraffe. Through other animals have their part as well. In the stories, animals often have human characteristics. For instance, some of the African folktales don't have happy endings but instead impart a lesson. Other stories are origin stories, such as explaining why fish live in water. So, if you remember, no, I've mentioned the animals as the main characters in tales and referring to a hero, and also um, the stories are came from the historical aspects and based on their culture. So next is the African writers and their works. So I chose 10 most famous African writers. Number one is Chinua Achebe. So one of the world's most widely recognized and praised writers. He is a Nigerian novelist. And yon, kanina ay nabanggit din siya dun sa Arrow of God. He is the author of Arrow of God. And next, um, famous ano niya na sinulat is the Things Fall Apart in 1958. So, next is si Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. So, born in Nigeria in 1977. So, I mentioned din kanina yung Purple Hibiscus. So, siya din yung nagsulat nun. And Americana in 2013. So, next is the Isle Kwe Arma. So, his novels are known for their intense, powerful depictions of political devastation and social frustration in Arma's native Ghana, told from the point of view of the individual. So, um, one of their works is The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born in 1968. Next is the Mariama Ba. So, one of the Africa's most influential women authors. So, one of her work is the So Long a Letter in 1981. Next is Nuruddin Farah. He written numerous plays, novels, and short stories, of all which revolve around his experiences of his native country. So one of his famous works, no, From a Crook Reef in 1970. So next is the Aminata Forna, born in Glasgow but raised in Sierra Leone. So her work is The Devil That Danced on Water in 2003, The Memory of Love in 2010. Nadine Gordimer, so one of the apartheid era's most prolific writers. So she also won a Nobel Prize in Literature. So one of her work is The Burger's Daughter. Next is the Alain Mabankou. Works are written primarily in French and are well known for their biting wit, sharp satire, and insightful social commentary into both Africa and African immigrants in France. Her works are The Broken Glasses and The Black Bazaar. Next is Ben Okri. Ben Okri's childhood was divided between England and time in his native Nigeria. So, ito yung mga naisulat niya. So, Flowers and Shadows in 1980. The Landscapes in 1981. The Famished Road 1991. Last is the Ngungi Wa Chonko. So, na-mention ko din siya kanina. And one of Africa's most important and influential post-colonial writers. So, yun. His work is With Not Child. So, in 1964. in conclusion, no, dito sa African literature, though it has a complexity, nung na-mention kanina, and based on their literature is more of metaphorical, figurative, and also they use realistic images, no, and more on actual or performative way of literature than written literature. Kasi we usually um, nasanay kasi tayo na literature is only written, no? But in African, they mas ano sa kanilang oral literature. And also, yun nga, more on imagery and more on um, based on history, may historical and cultural yung um, characterized ng literature nila. So, and also the stories or the uh, writings of the authors are based from their influence on the colonialism, um, on the given theme, no, dun sa five themes ng African literature, which is the colonialism, the nationalism, the liberation, displacement, and the tradition. So, doon pumapasok lahat yung mga mga experiences during that colonialism ng French or mga European countries during that time. But I've also mentioned that there already existed their literature in their native language. So may mga literature na rin naman sila na ginagamit on their native language talaga. And yun, bago pa man sila sakupin ng mga French. Yun nga, yung kanina sa mga poetry, no, na-influence din sila pagsusulat that time because of the French colonization. So, as you observe dun sa mga writings are written in French. And the stories, the fables, and the uh, folk folklore yon are also based on the past events, no, and their influence during the slavery. And yes, the African literature, though it's there is a similarities and differences with the Asian, but African literature is very unique in terms of their history and traditions.